The concrete ribs of the underground parking garage swallowed the hum of Joey's engine, replacing it with a heavy, oppressive silence. It was 2:14 a.m. The air down here was different than the crisp night air they'd left behind. It was stagnant, smelling of old oil, damp stone, and something metallic that bit at the back of the throat. "I still say that last act was a bit much," Joey said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the cramped space. He steered the car into their usual spot, level B4, right next to the looming concrete pillar marked with a faded yellow 12. Ashley didn't answer. She was staring out the passenger window, her fingers tracing the seam of her seatbelt. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a sick, flickering yellow pulse, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to stretch and retract like reaching fingers. "Ash?" Joey killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "You okay? You've been quiet since we hit the ramp." Ashley swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the elevator bank. About 50 yards away, the elevator doors were brushed steel, reflecting the dim light in blurred, distorted streaks. To the left of the doors, partially obscured by a stack of discarded wooden pallets, stood a figure. "Joey," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Don't turn the lights off." "What? I already did. What's wrong?" "Turn them back on, please." Joey frowned but reached for the dial. The headlights cut through the gloom, two bright cones of white light that splashed against the far wall in the elevator doors. Ashley gasped, pressing her back against the seat. In the direct glare of the LEDs, the figure was unmistakable. It was a woman. She was standing perfectly still, draped in a wedding dress that might have been beautiful once. Now, it was a ruin of yellowed lace and tattered silk, stained with dark, spreading patches that looked like dried wine or old blood. The skirt was voluminous, pooling on the dirty concrete floor like a dying lily. But it was the bodice that made Ashley's heart skip a beat and then hammer against her ribs. Above the high, lace-trimmed collar, there was nothing. No neck, no chin, no face. Just a jagged, cauterized stump of flesh, where a head should have been. The lace around the neckline was soaked a deep, permanent crimson. "Joey, look!" Ashley hissed, her hand trembling as she pointed. Joey leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "What am I looking at? The pallets?" "No, beside the elevator. The woman, the dress." Joey stared for a long 10 seconds. "Ash, there's nothing there. It's just the shadow from the pallets. You're just tired. That movie really got to you." "It's not a shadow." Ashley's voice rose to a panicked pitch. "She's right there. She's wearing a wedding dress, Joey. She doesn't have a head." Wasn't the type for pranks. He looked again. To him, the area by the elevator was a mess of gray shadows and industrial clutter. "Look, I'll get out and show you. It's just some trash or a reflection." "No, Joey, stay in the car." But Joey was already opening his door. The chime of the door-open sensor rang out, rhythmic and mocking in the silence of the garage. As Joey stepped out, Ashley watched the figure. The headless bride didn't move, but Ashley felt a coldness radiating from her, a sense of profound, agonizing grief that seemed to lower the temperature in the car by 20 degrees. "See?" Joey shouted, his voice bouncing off the low ceiling. He walked a few paces toward the elevator. "Nothing. Just concrete and—" He stopped. From Ashley's perspective, Joey was now standing less than 10 feet from the woman. The woman, who had been facing the elevator, slowly began to rotate. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of silk. She simply pivoted on the spot, the tattered hem of her dress dragging across the grit. She was facing Joey now. "Joey, get back!" Ashley screamed, fumbling for the door handle to run to him. But her limbs felt like lead. Joey stood frozen. He still couldn't see the woman, but he felt it. A sudden, sharp scent of lilies and rot filled his nostrils. The air around him turned thick, like he was standing at the bottom of a cold lake. His skin crawled with the sensation of 1,000 invisible needles. Then, he heard it. Not a voice, but a sound. A wet, bubbling gurgle coming from the air, right in front of his face. It sounded like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of fluid. Ashley watched in horror as the headless figure reached out. Its hands were pale, the fingernails cracked and blue. It placed a hand on Joey's shoulder. Joey's knees buckled. He didn't see the hand, but he felt the weight, a cold, crushing pressure that felt like a block of ice being pressed into his collarbone. He let out a choked cry, stumbling backward. "Get in the car!" Ashley shrieked. Joey scrambled back, his heels skidding on the oily floor. He lunged into the driver's seat and slammed the door. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and unfocused. I felt something touched me, Ash. Something cold. "Drive," she sobbed. "Just drive." Joey jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine groaned, a slow, dying crank. Come on, come on. Joey pounded the steering wheel. Ashley looked out the window. The headless bride was no longer by the elevator. She was standing right outside Joey's door. Through the glass, Ashley could see the raw, jagged edges of the neck stump. She could see the delicate pearls sewn into the lace of the bodice, now caked with dark filth. The woman leaned down. Even without eyes, she was looking at them. A pale, bloodless finger rose and pressed against the driver's side window. It moved slowly, tracing a shape in the thin layer of dust on the glass. It drew a circle. Then, inside the circle, it drew a cross. The mark of a silent vow. The engine finally roared to life. Joey didn't wait. He slammed the car into reverse, the tires screaming as he peeled out of the spot. He swung the car around, his headlights sweeping across the garage. The woman was everywhere. In the rearview mirror, she was standing behind them. When Joey looked toward the exit ramp, she was leaning against a pillar 20 yards ahead. Each time the light hit her, she was closer. "She's following us!" Ashley cried, shielding her eyes. "Joey, she's in front of us!" Joey gritted his teeth, flooring the accelerator. He drove straight through the space where the figure stood. There was no impact, no thud, just a momentary plunge into a pocket of freezing air that made the windshield frost over from the inside. They hit the ramp, the car bottoming out as they sped upward. Level B3, level B2, level B1. Finally, they burst through the security gate and onto the city street. The orange glow of the streetlights felt like a sanctuary. Joey didn't stop until they were 3 blocks away, parked under a bright light in front of a 24-hour convenience store. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine. "Is she—" Joey started, his voice trembling. "Is she gone?" Ashley looked around. The street was empty. No white dresses, no headless shadows. "I think so." Joey let out a long, shuddering breath. He reached up to wipe the sweat from his forehead, and his hand brushed against his shoulder, the spot where he had felt the cold pressure in the garage. He froze. "What is it?" Ashley asked, her heart rising into her throat. Joey slowly turned his head. On the shoulder of his black leather jacket, there was a mark. It wasn't a bruise. It was a perfect frosty handprint, the ice crystals shimmering under the convenience store lights. And then Ashley looked at the driver's side window. In the dust on the outside of the glass, the circle and the cross were still there. But as they watched, new words began to appear, etched into the grime by an invisible finger. "Till death." From the back seat, a soft, wet, bubbling gurgle filled the car. Ashley didn't turn around. She couldn't. She just looked into the rearview mirror. Sitting in the middle of the back seat was a large, ornate hat box wrapped in yellowed silk ribbon. The ribbon was wet, and from beneath the lid of the box, a single lock of long, dark hair escaped, twitching as if the head inside was still trying to turn. The hum of the tires against the asphalt had become a hypnotic drone, a rhythmic vibration that Jeremy felt in his very marrow. He had been driving for 10 hours straight, the black ribbon of the interstate stretching infinitely into the darkness of the Midwest. His eyes were shot through with jagged red veins, and the caffeine that had sustained him for the first 6 hours had long since curdled into a jittery, hollow exhaustion. By the time he pulled into the outskirts of a town whose name he hadn't even bothered to read on the exit sign, the world felt thin. The streetlights were sparse, casting long, sickly yellow pools on the cracked pavement. He needed sleep. Not just a nap, but the kind of heavy, oblivious slumber that would wipe the phantom lines of the highway from his vision. He found a sprawling, nearly empty parking lot behind a shuttered grocery store. A single buzzing halogen lamp flickered at the far end, casting a strobe-like effect over a row of rusted shopping carts. Jeremy steered his sedan into a spot deep in the shadows, far from the reach of that dying light. He cut the engine. The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. Without the roar of the wind and the mechanical growl of the motor, the air inside the car felt heavy, pressurized. Jeremy exhaled a long, shuddering breath and leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. His neck cracked, a sound like dry kindling snapping, and he winced. Just 20 minutes, he thought. Just enough to clear the fog. He reached up to adjust the rearview mirror, intending to check the darkness behind him one last time before locking the doors and drifting off. His fingers brushed the cold plastic, angling the glass downward. His heart didn't just skip a beat. It seemed to stop entirely, turning into a cold stone in his chest. In the reflected dimness of the back seat, a figure sat perfectly still. It was a nun. She was dressed in a traditional black habit, the heavy wool appearing almost ink-like in the shadows. Her wimple was a stark, aggressive white, framing a face that was tilted slightly downward, hidden in the gloom. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, fingers entwined in a way that suggested prayer, but her knuckles were bone white, as if she were gripping herself with impossible strength. Jeremy didn't scream. His throat had constricted so tightly that he could barely draw breath. A primal electric terror surged through him, making his skin crawl as if thousands of insects were dancing beneath the surface. He remained frozen, his hand still hovering near the mirror, his eyes locked onto the reflection. "Who are you?" he whispered. The words were a dry rasp, barely audible over the thudding of his pulse in his ears. The nun didn't move. She didn't breathe. There was no rise and fall of her shoulders, no blink of an eyelid. She was a statue carved from the very darkness of the car's interior. Jeremy's mind raced, offering up frantic, logical explanations that his gut immediately rejected. Maybe she was there the whole time? Maybe I didn't notice her at the gas station? But he knew he had tossed his jacket into the back seat 3 hours ago. The seat had been empty. He would have felt the weight. He would have seen her. Slowly, with agonizing deliberation, Jeremy moved his hand toward the door handle. He didn't want to turn around. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him that looking at her directly would be a fatal mistake. He just needed to get out. The lock clicked. The sound was deafening in the silence. He pulled the handle. The door didn't budge. He pulled harder, his knuckles bruising against the plastic. It was as if the car had been welded shut. He glanced at the electronic lock button on the armrest. The red light was off, but when he pressed it, nothing happened. No mechanical whir, no click. The car was dead. "Please," Jeremy choked out, a tear of pure terror tracking down his cheek. "Please, just go. Take the car. Take whatever you want." The nun's head began to tilt. It wasn't a natural movement. It moved in sharp, rhythmic ticks, like the second hand of a clock. As her face rose into the sliver of light coming from the distant parking lot lamp, Jeremy saw her eyes. Or rather, the lack of them. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, cavernous pits of shadow, rimmed with a raw, inflamed redness. Her skin was the color of wet ash, pulled so tightly over her skull that the shape of her teeth was visible through her pale, bloodless lips. She wasn't praying. As her hand shifted, Jeremy realized she wasn't holding a rosary. She was holding a length of old, yellowed cord, the kind used for heavy drapes, and it was looped into a noose. The smell hit him then. It was the scent of a basement that had been flooded and forgotten for decades. It was the smell of damp earth, stagnant water, and something sickly sweet, like rotting lilies. The nun opened her mouth. It didn't open like a human's. It unhinged, stretching wider than should have been physically possible, revealing a gullet that seemed to lead into a bottomless void. No sound came out, but the air in the car suddenly turned freezing. Jeremy's breath came out in a white plume. "The long drive is over, Jeremy," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the air. It resonated inside his own skull, vibrating his teeth. It was a voice composed of 1,000 dry leaves skittering across a grave. You've been running for so long, but the road always ends here. Jeremy scrambled, throwing his weight against the driver's side window, pounding on the glass with his fists. Help! Someone help me! Through the glass, the empty parking lot mocked him. The flickering halogen light finally gave out with a pop, plunging the world outside into total blackness. He was alone in a vacuum of steel and glass, with something that had never known the warmth of life. He felt a cold, clammy pressure on his shoulder. He didn't want to look. He fought the urge with everything he had, but his head turned as if pulled by invisible wires. The nun was leaning forward now, her face inches from his. The pits where her eyes should have been were swirling with a faint, necrotic gray mist. He could see the individual threads of her ancient habit, caked with the dust of a century. She raised the noose. I didn't do anything, Jeremy sobbed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched wail. I don't know who you are. We know who you are, the voices hissed in unison. We are the silence you tried to outrun. We are the dark between the stars. Her fingers, long and spindly like the legs of a dead spider, brushed against his neck. The touch was colder than ice. It felt like a burn. Jeremy tried to scream one last time, but the noose was already dropping over his head. In the morning, the grocery store manager would find the car. It would be parked perfectly within the lines, the engine cold, the doors locked from the inside. When the police eventually shattered the glass, they would find Jeremy sitting in the driver's seat. His eyes would be wide, fixed on the rearview mirror with an expression of frozen, eternal shock. His hands would be gripped so tightly around the steering wheel that they would have to break his fingers to remove them. The back seat would be empty. But on the floor mat, directly behind the driver's seat, they would find a single, small, silver crucifix, tarnished black by time, and a faint, lingering scent of damp earth and rotting lilies. The fluorescent lights of the P4 parking level hummed with a low, dying frequency, flickering just enough to make the shadows dance. Miguel's footsteps echoed, a rhythmic, lonely sound that seemed too loud for the 3 a.m. silence. Every breath he took came out as a faint mist in the damp, subterranean chill. He reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling for his keys. The metallic jingle was the only thing anchoring him to reality. He hated this shift. He hated this garage. It always felt like the concrete was leaning in, exhaling the stale scent of old exhaust and wet stone. His sedan sat 50 yards away, a silver island in a sea of empty stalls. Miguel pressed the unlock button. The car's lights flashed twice, the chirp-chirp bouncing off the low ceiling and returning to him like a mocking bird call. That was when he saw it. About 20 feet ahead, a massive concrete support pillar, stained with watermarks and grime, stood between him and his vehicle. From behind the curved edge of the pillar, a head was peeking out. Miguel froze. At first, he thought it was a squatter or perhaps a security guard playing a sick joke. But the proportions were wrong. The head was tilted at an impossible 90-degree angle, resting against the cold stone. And then, there were the eyes. They weren't reflecting the overhead lights. They were emitting their own. 2 pinpricks of crimson light, burning like dying embers in a hearth, stared directly at him. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They simply pulsed, with a rhythmic, sickening glow. Hey, Miguel's voice was a thin thread. Who's there? The figure didn't respond. It didn't retreat. It just watched. Miguel took a cautious step back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He considered running back to the elevator, but the doors were behind a long, dark corridor he didn't want to re-enter. His car was closer. If he could just reach the door, lock it, and drive. He began to circle wide, keeping his eyes locked on the pillar. As he moved, the head moved with him, rotating slowly to maintain that horrific, fixed stare. The red glow intensified, casting a faint, bloody hue onto the concrete of the pillar. I'm calling the police, Miguel lied, his hand trembling as he reached for his phone. The moment his gaze flickered down to his screen, he heard it. The sound of bare skin slapping against wet concrete. He looked up. The pillar was empty. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Miguel didn't wait. He bolted. His work boots skidded on an oil slick as he lunged for the driver's side door. He grabbed the handle, tore it open, and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut and hitting the power locks in one fluid, panicked motion. He sat there, gasping, his chest heaving. Through the windshield, the parking lot looked empty. The red eyes were gone. "Just a trick of the light," he whispered, though he didn't believe it. Just exhaustion. He shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine cranked, sputtered, and died. No, not now. Please. He turned it again. The car groaned. Outside, the flickering fluorescent light directly above his car finally gave out, plunging him into a pocket of thick, oppressive darkness. Then he heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the front. It was coming from the glass directly behind his head. Miguel's blood turned to ice. He didn't want to look. He knew what was there. But the human instinct to face a predator won out. He slowly turned his head toward the rear passenger window. The red eyes were pressed against the glass. There was no face, only a mass of pale, translucent skin stretched tight over a jagged skull. The creature had no nose, no ears, and its mouth was a jagged, vertical seam that seemed stitched shut with rusted wire. The red light from its eyes illuminated the interior of the car, bathing Miguel's hands in a gore-colored light. The creature raised a hand, long, spindly fingers tipped with black, needle-like nails. It didn't try to break the glass. It simply placed its palm against the window. Miguel screamed as the engine suddenly roared to life. He didn't check his mirrors. He slammed the car into reverse, tires shrieking as he tore out of the parking space. He shifted into drive and floored it, the speedometer climbing as he raced toward the exit ramp. He burst through the wooden gate, the plastic arm snapping like a toothpick, and didn't stop until he reached the bright, crowded lights of a 24-hour gas station 3 miles away. He sat under the harsh white LEDs of the station, shaking so violently he could barely hold his phone. He looked into his rearview mirror, half expecting to see those red eyes in the back seat. The seat was empty. Relief began to wash over him, until he noticed something on the back window. The glass was fogged from the humidity of the night. And there, etched clearly into the condensation on the inside of the car, was the perfect, skeletal print of a long-fingered hand. Miguel looked at the dashboard clock. It was 3:33 a.m., and then, from the darkness of the footwell beneath his own seat, he saw 2 small red circles begin to glow